Hi, I am Dr. Camara Phyllis Jones, a family physician and PhD epidemiologist, past president of the American Public Health Association, and an anti-racism thought leader and activist. And today I want to share with you all my brief ideas about confronting racism denial, naming racism, and moving to action. So, as president of the American Public Health Association 6 years ago in 2016, I launched our association and our state affiliates and as many other organizations and communities as would join us on a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks. The first being to name racism because we have to name a problem in order to get started on the solution. But as necessary as naming racism is, it's necessary but insufficient. We need to move to action. We all know that in the NAACP for decades, right? For more than a century. So the second of the 3 tasks is to ask the question, how is racism operating here? In my child's daycare, with regard to the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, with regard to police killings of unarmed Black and brown men and women. And that question will lead us to identify levers for intervention, targets for action. And then the third task, after we've done that landscaping, is to organize and strategize to act. Because yes, of course, we can act in our own individual capacities. We can put things on agendas. We can hire a student or do whatever community work we want to as an individual. But it is my experience that collective action is power, because collective action informs us, it inspires us, it propels us, and it protects us. Now, I only have a few minutes today with you. So I'm going to focus on that first task of naming racism. And there are 4 key messages when naming racism. The first, of course, is that racism exists. And there are many people in this country who are in staunch denial of the continued existence of racism and its profoundly negative impacts on the health and well-being of the nation. In fact, racism denial, I am understanding these days to be like a huge black hole in our national landscape, like black holes in the universe. Black holes in the universe are massive and powerful, and they suck anything that comes near into them. And they're invisible because even when light comes near, it gets sucked in. That is how racism denial is in our nation. So the first of the 4 key tasks when naming racism is, the first of the 4 key messages when naming racism is that racism exists. But the second is that racism is a system. The third is that racism saps the strength of the whole society. And the fourth, yes, we can act to dismantle racism. So now I'm going to share with you one of my teaching stories, one of my allegories that I use in talking to folks about race and racism and equipping us to talk to other folks about race and racism. This one I call Dual Reality, a restaurant saga. It's based on what happened to me in my own real life as a first-year medical student. And the moral of this story is that first key message, racism exists. So now step into my shoes as a first-year medical student on this particular Saturday. Like on most, I had awakened early. And what did I do? I hit those books and hit them hard, studying nose deep. And it was already mid-afternoon when some friends came over. And did my friends distract me from my studies? Oh no, we all got to studying long and hard. And now it was getting late and we were getting hungry. And I had no food in the apartment, which was so typical of me that my friends actually understood. And they were like, okay, never mind, Camara, we got that, but we're hungry. So let's go into town and find something to eat. So we do. So we walk into town, we find a restaurant, we walk in, we sit down, menus are presented, we order our food, food is served, here we are eating. So maybe not the story about racism exists in a restaurant that people in my generation thought I was about to tell. But hold on. As I sat there with my friends eating, I looked across the room And I noticed a sign that was a startling revelation to me about racism. So now I hope I've intrigued you. And you're wondering, okay, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? Oh, well, what did the sign say? The sign said open. So now perhaps I've lost many of you. How does a sign saying open, how is that a startling revelation about racism? Well, let me recap. Here I am sitting with my friends in a restaurant eating. I look up, I see a sign that says open, thinking no more about it. I assume other hungry people can come in, sit down, order their food and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that indeed the restaurant was now closed due to the hour, but firmly closed. And that other hungry people, just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of that sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food and eat. And that's when I recognized that racism structures open, closed signs in our society. That racism structures, if you will, a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So for example, it is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. In fact, it is difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, although we are living it so large right now with how much of the global supply of COVID-19 vaccine we have sequestered in this country. I've already had 4 shots when other people in this hemisphere are having difficulty getting to their first. Now, those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism. It's actually an empowering thing to name racism. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, why you could even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you could say, restaurant owner, they're hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door, let them come in? You'll make more money. And oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you'll do is pass food through the window or try to tear down the sign or break through the door. But at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign that proclaims open to you. So when I have 5 or 6 minutes to either equip people to describe in a very vivid way that most people can remember. And I'm hoping that you all will remember this image and pass it on to your neighbors, your colleagues, coworkers, your family members and all. But when I have the opportunity, especially if it's a group of people whose whole life experience has proclaimed that this is the land of equal opportunity, to let them know that yes, racism exists. It's structuring a two-sided or multi-sided sign. It's creating a dual or multifaceted reality. This is the story that I tell. Now, I have actually, on 2 separate occasions, started a 3-hour conversation each time with the following question. How could people who were born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? And each time it was a 3-hour conversation because there are many, many ways to know. I have to say that I am heartened that more people who were born inside the restaurant and just 2.5 years ago might have been sitting inside eating and saying, what are those people outside saying? Black lives matter. Don't they know all lives matter? More of those people are actually proclaiming, yes, Black lives matter. More people born inside the restaurant are saying the word racism, putting together the phrases, structural racism, systemic racism. This is heartening because we must name a problem in order to get started on the solution. But here is my warning to those people who would just say a thing, those people who would just put something on their institutional web pages or tweet something out or Instagram or on their Facebook or however they are rolling, right? My warning is 6 months from now, those who are just saying a thing, naming racism, may well forget why they said that thing, because racism denial is so staunchly held by so many in this society, and it's so seductive that 6 months from now, if you just say a thing, you may forget why you said the thing and fall into what I describe as the sleepiness. Whew. The somnolence of racism denial. So we all must go beyond naming racism to action, which means we need to be tearing down the sign. And of course, racism is not just a sign. It's the sign, it's the door, it's the lock. There's a whole system going on. We need to dismantle the lock, take the door off the hinges. And once we start acting, we will not forget why we are acting. Now, I hope that all of you all will remember the main elements of that story and share it on. I have found in my experience that it is particularly good as a way of conveying to people whose whole life experience has been that, you know, this is the land of equal opportunity, that yes, racism does exist in the same way that we have two-sided signs. In fact, you know, we would never need a sign that says open unless on the other side it said closed. So all this open verbiage and everything that people communicate is only really by even having to say that, communicating that indeed there's a two-sided sign going on. When I say the word racism, I'm clear that I'm talking about a system. So I'm not talking about an individual character flaw, personal moral failing, psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. And yes, it does show up in all of those ways, but in its systems, in its essence, racism is a system of power, and a system of doing what? A system of doing two things: a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on so-called race, based on the social interpretation of how one looks in this race-conscious society. I used to do an hour-long lecture on what is race. We don't have time. But what I'm saying is race is the on-the-street classification of people one to the other without the benefit of even asking, excuse me, how do you self-identify? Or excuse me, where were you born? Where were your parents born? Or even, excuse me, may I have a little aliquot of your blood? I have an interesting genetic hypothesis. What I am saying to you is that race is not written in our genes. So if race is the social interpretation of how one looks in our race-conscious society, racism is the system that operates on that substrate of race to structure opportunity and assign value, and it has impacts. Now, when people recognize that racism exists, they usually understand, yes, it is unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take any of us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. That's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that, you know, we hardly ever talk about in this country because it makes some people, especially some people who are living as white, uncomfortable. I used to almost apologize for that discomfort when people would start to fidget in their chairs. When I got to this part of my definition, I used to say, oh, well, I'm not trying to make anybody uncomfortable. Shake it off. Stay with me. I'll tell you more stories. I don't do that anymore. If people feel uncomfortable acknowledging the reality of unearned white privilege, I encourage them to lean into that discomfort, because I have come to recognize that for all of us, the edge of our comfort is actually our growing edge. But there's a third impact of racism that many people miss, and that is that racism is sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So when we don't vigorously invest in the full, excellent public education of all of our children because some decision makers have blinders on that make them think there's no genius in the barrios, the ghettos, on the reservations, we can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. Well, of course, there's genius in all of our communities. And if we were to only vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation or even as a world. Those same blinders that don't value all of us equally have made us as a nation complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many Black and brown men in our prison system, as if that didn't separate us from human potential. And actually, I could wax eloquently on how racism saps the strength of the whole society for another long time. I won't, but I will say that I think that that third impact about how racism is sapping the strength of the whole society is the impact that we need to lift up even more urgently these days. We need more media stories about that, more data collection about that. We need more conversations around our faculty tables, boardroom tables, dining room tables, so that more people are filled with a sense of urgency in this country to dismantle racism and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. I'm going to shift gears slightly to say, I have also been thinking a lot as I think about confronting racism denial, that there are many people in this country who value comfort, and there are many people in this country who value social justice. And in the current status quo, valuing comfort and valuing social justice are at polar opposite ends of the spectrum. Indeed, those people who value comfort are very much like those who were born inside the restaurant, or at least sitting there now, at the table of opportunity eating. They value comfort because they're made comfortable by the status quo. They are benefited by the status quo. They don't even wonder, why isn't somebody else coming in? They may not even notice it. They're so involved in their conversation and their food. They certainly don't want to examine the sign. They may have been told that, yes, there's a two-sided sign going on. They are passing laws all across this nation to make it illegal or scary or difficult for somebody to go and say, is there really, does it really say closed on the other side of this sign, right? Because it would make the children, or at least their children, uncomfortable. They don't care to know what the outsiders are saying. They're not even craning to hear what they're saying. In fact, they don't even believe an outsider could add anything to their conversation. They may have been told that, well, you know, you need to diversify your table. And they might say, well, maybe that will make a more politically correct picture. But they really don't understand that the outsiders could bring genius and insight and so much greatness to the work that's going on inside that restaurant. And on the outside, I might say. They don't wonder how the food that they're eating even gets there. They don't recognize that many of the outsiders who can't come in and eat in the restaurant actually are the ones who grow the food, transport the food, bring it around to the kitchen, cook the food, serve the food, but can't eat there. And they certainly do not want to budge from their seats of privilege at the table. They jealously guard their seats at the table. Now, those who value social justice, they value social justice because they know two things. The first thing they know is that there is a two-sided sign going on. Many of them know that because they were born outside the restaurant and they see the sign proclaiming closed, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. But they also know that the operation of this two-sided sign saps the strength of the whole society. And I am not saying that the circumstances of a person's birth consign them to either valuing comfort or valuing social justice. I do acknowledge that there are people who were born inside the restaurant who may wonder, why aren't more people coming in? What are those people outside saying? And they may, as hard as it might be, but you know, they may make their way outside, read the other side of the sign, talk to strangers, go across town and stay a while, live in somebody else's experience, and understand that the people just across town who are just as smart, generous, funny, hardworking as they are, right? Who are living in very different circumstances. And there are people who are born outside the restaurant, who do make it inside. It's a much harder path, and they have to do all kind of documentation about how hard they worked. But the most scary thing to me is often they are asked to deny as a qualification for entry that they will henceforth deny that they ever saw that there was a two-sided sign going on. And often those people are positioned near the window so that the others outside can see them. Sometimes they're positioned near the window, also puts them near the door, and they can stick their foot in the door to make it easier for more people to come in. But sometimes their position near the door makes them feel like they need to act as gatekeepers. I'm not going to go even more deeper into all that this story could help us understand, except to say that our challenge as NAACP, as people in our worlds, in our neighborhoods, we need to in our actions, create a move so that we move more people from valuing comfort to valuing social justice, even as we recognize that in the status quo, valuing social justice will not always, or maybe not even ever, be comfortable. So I'm going to close with that same image, but asking, what can we do today? And so first of all, we need to actively, in all of our professional and civic roles, we need to actively look for evidence of two-sided signs. We should never be satisfied that, oh, it looks open to me. So we need to ask, is there something differential going on here by race, by gender, by immigration status, by language, by zip code, by urban, rural, by religion, by all of the ways that we differentially structure opportunity and assign value. And we need to look not just at outcomes, but also at opportunity structures. We need to burst through our bubbles of experience to experience our common humanity on the other side of town, right? All of us are in a bubble of experience. Some of our bubbles are quite vast with thin soap bubble boundaries. Some of our bubbles are smaller with thicker, plexiglass boundaries. Some of our bubbles are tinted. Some of our bubbles are polarized. In the current context, some people's bubbles have been hardened by fear. But in whatever kind of bubble we are in, even us, most of us do not really know that just across town, there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are. We're living in very different circumstances. We need to create as individuals and as organizations bubble bursting opportunities so that we can burst through our bubbles to experience our common humanity on the other side of town and then start building common cause. We need to be interested in the stories of others. We need to believe the stories of others without requiring cell phone video documentation or, God forbid, body cam footage. And we need to join in the stories of others. We need to develop a sensitivity to see the absence of who is not at the decision-making table, what is not on the agenda, what policies are not in place that if put in place could bring about more social justice. We need to reveal inaction, lack of action in the face of need, because lack of action, inaction in the face of need is how structural racism very often shows up these days. But all the power certainly is not on the part of those who are inside the restaurant. Those of us on the outside need to know our power, to recognize that action is power, and especially that collective action is power, because collective action, as I said, informs us, inspires us, propels us, protects us. And what we need to do is also build a critical mass, grow the collective as we bring more people from valuing comfort to valuing social justice, because collective action combined with a critical mass is real power. So I'm so delighted to have been able to share these thoughts with this NAACP audience today. And this is how you can reach me if you would like to. Thank you very much.